The morning the candidates arrived, the wind had already stripped the prayer flags from the eastern parapet. I stood at the gallery rail and watched the transport pods settle onto the landing terrace one by one, their repulsors scattering loose gravel across stone that was older than the conclave itself. 3 pods, 3 candidates. I had read their files twice over breakfast and found nothing in them that made me believe any of this would matter. My sister stood at the far window with her hands behind her back, watching the same terrace. She did not turn when I came in. She had not spoken since the formal summons arrived 6 days ago, except to confirm the catering arrangements and to ask whether the resonance gallery had been swept. It had. I had done it myself on my knees with a hand broom because the last custodial aide had left the fortress 11 years ago and we had not replaced him. There were 9 of us left in the Kayan fortress. 9 staff, 2 of us by blood. The fortress had been built for 600. That is what censure does. Not the formal stripping of titles, not the diplomatic isolation, not even the trade restrictions. Those are only the visible architecture of punishment. The real weight is subtler. It is the slow drain of people. The ones who leave first are the ambitious ones, the ones whose careers depend on association. Then the administrative ones, the ones who need functioning supply chains and institutional support. Then the loyal ones, the last ones, the ones who stay until they simply cannot anymore, until their children need schools that the Can district no longer funds, until their own health requires medical infrastructure that a censured house cannot maintain. My sister watched them all go. She thanked every one of them. She never asked anyone to stay. I stayed because she is my sister, and because someone had to keep the East Wing from flooding every storm season, and because I remembered her name. That is the part most people do not understand. When the conclave censured House Soth Can 30 years ago, I was 4 years old. Valara was 11. The formal decree did not merely strip our voting seat or freeze our territorial claims. It struck her given name from the address register. She became the Soth Can in every official document, every diplomatic exchange, every court filing. The occupant of the Kayan seat, the censured party, the designate, never Valara. I have watched diplomats, traders, relief coordinators, and conclave auditors pass for its fortress for 3 decades. Not one of them has said her name. Some of them did not know it. Some of them knew it and chose not to use it, because using a struck name in a formal setting is considered a breach of conclave protocol, a minor diplomatic incident, a thing that generates paperwork. It was easier to say, the Soth Can. It was always easier. She stopped correcting anyone after the first year. She was 12. I remember the day she stopped. A trade auditor had come to inspect our mineral exports, a routine visit, the kind that happened quarterly in those early years when the conclave still pretended to maintain regular oversight. He had addressed her 3 times as the Soth Can, and the 3rd time she had opened her mouth to correct him, and I had watched her close it again. Not in defeat, in decision. She had decided that the energy it cost to correct people was energy she needed for other things, for the governance of a censured house, for the maintenance of a fortress that was already beginning to lose staff, for the slow, unglamorous work of holding a seat that the conclave wanted her to abandon. She was 12, and she had already learned that some battles are not worth fighting, because the battlefield is designed for you to lose. The censure itself had been over a failed treaty, our father's treaty, negotiated when Valara was still learning her formal address cadences. A border stabilization accord with the Heth-Varani Compact that collapsed within 8 months over resource extraction disputes that had nothing do with our house and everything to do with conclave mismanagement of the Varani mineral corridor. But the conclave needed a house to blame, and ours was small enough to absorb the punishment without destabilizing anything important. Our father accepted the censure to prevent a wider conflict. He died 4 years later. Valara inherited the seat at 15. The censure came with it. She has held it for 26 years. She has petitioned for review 9 times. Every petition was tabled, not rejected, tabled, left in a queue that does not move. And now this. The resonance trial, the conclave's latest mechanism for managing a problem they created. A provision in the original censure document that allows for lifting if the occupant of the KN seat accepts a match certified by the old resonance right. An ancient compatibility protocol built into the fortress walls themselves by the house's founders, designed to verify the alignment between a bloodline and a chosen partner. The stones in the resonance gallery are supposed to hum when the match is true. They have been silent for longer than I have been alive. The conclave sent 3 candidates. They chose the candidates. My sister did not get a say. I had spent the previous evening preparing the gallery. I had set 3 chairs on the candidate side, spaced at the regulation interval the old protocol manual prescribed. I had positioned the speaker's mark, a pale circle of inlaid stone on the gallery floor, and measured its distance from my sister's position with a length of cord because precision seemed like the only thing I could control. The cook, Halveth, had prepared a tray of Velsoth tea and hard grain cakes, the standard reception offering, though the tea was from our diminished stores and the grain cakes were denser than tradition called for because we had run out of the light flour too. Months ago and I had been substituting coarser milled stock from the mountain village below. None of this mattered to anyone but me. It mattered to me because the fortress was all I had, and my sister was all I had, and if we were going to be evaluated by strangers, the tea was going to be hot, and the gallery was going to be clean. The first one off the transport was Sarath Vel Iman, Deputy Cultural Liaison for the Inner Conclave. I recognized him from his file. Tall, precise, his formal robes cut in the current Vel Iman style. High collar, asymmetric drape, embroidered house crest at the left shoulder in thread of gold. His skin was the pale copper of the Northern Territories, his hair white silver and cropped short, his bearing the kind of practiced ease that comes from a lifetime of never being questioned. He stepped onto the terrace, surveyed the fortress with a single slow turn of his head, and adjusted his collar. The adjustment was deliberate. It said, "I am here because I was sent, and I have dressed accordingly, and I expect this to be brief." The second was Kalith Oronsev, a military strategist from the Oronsev Border Command. Shorter, broader, her armor ceremonial but real, scarred at the joints, the dark green plates fitted with the kind of precision that meant they had seen use. She had a reputation as a competent officer and an ambitious one. Her file noted 2 commendations, a border skirmish record, and a recent appointment to the Conclave's Advisory Council on territorial disputes. She looked at the fortress the way an engineer looks at a condemned structure, assessing load-bearing walls, calculating what could be salvaged. Her eyes moved from the stripped parapet to the cracked courtyard stones to the patched mortar on the east wing, and I watched her catalogue every sign of decay with the practiced efficiency of someone who evaluates infrastructure for a living. The third was the human. His name was Kale Wren. His file was the thinnest of the 3, 4 pages, mostly administrative. Frontier mineral surveyor, employed by the Conclave's Resource Mapping Division for 9 years. His territory was the Verith Range Outer Corridor, the same mountain chain the Kayan fortress sits on, 600 kilometers south. He had been flagged for the resonance trial not because of any political standing or military record, but because a routine lineage audit, the kind the conclave runs every fiscal cycle to update its hereditary registries, had returned an anomalous compatibility marker, a bureaucratic artifact. His file called it a statistical outlier. The conclave had included him on the candidate list because the resonance provision required 3 candidates, and the first 2 were political appointments. He was filler. He came off the transport last. He was carrying a satchel over one shoulder, the kind surveyors use for field instruments, scuffed leather, a brass clasp that had been repaired with wire. His jacket was worn at the elbows, faded at the collar, the kind of garment a person wears because it fits, and because they have better things to think about than replacing it. He was average height, lean mid-30s by human reckoning, with dark hair going grey at the temples, and a face that had spent most of its years outdoors, weathered skin, sun lines at the eyes, a jaw that had been broken at least once and healed slightly off-center. He looked at the fortress the way a person looks at a mountain they have seen from a distance for years, and are now standing at the base of for the first time, not evaluating, not cataloging, seeing. He did not adjust anything, he just looked. I brought all 3 of them inside. The protocol required a formal reception in the gallery before the trial. Refreshments, introductions, a reading of the censure provision, and the resonance right requirements. I had written the reception script myself because there was no protocol. Officer left on staff, and I had practiced it twice in the kitchen that morning with Halveth as my audience. She had nodded at the appropriate points and told me my diction was clear, which I suspect was more kindness than critique. Sorath Vel Iman addressed me as the Soth Khan's representative. Kalith Oran Sev addressed me as the household coordinator. Both were technically accurate, neither was my name. Kelren said, "Thank you for the welcome. The tea is good." It was not good. The tea was from diminished stores and slightly oversteeped because I had been distracted by a loose hinge on the gallery door. But he held the cup with both hands the way mountain people do in cold weather, and he drank it, and he meant what he said, and that was a thing I noticed. He sat where I directed him and placed his satchel under his chair and folded his hands in his lap and waited. The other 2 candidates spoke to each other, quiet, practiced diplomatic small talk about transit delays and atmospheric conditions over the range. Kale watched the resonance stones in the gallery walls. I noticed because I was watching him, because he was the only one in the room who seemed to be looking at the stones at all. At one point, he set his tea down and stood, not abruptly, not with any apparent purpose, and walked to the nearest wall panel. He did not touch it. He stood about a hand's width from the surface and tilted his head, the way I have seen surveyors tilt their heads at rock faces in the field footage, the conclave archives for the geological division, reading the grain, tracing the crystalline structure with his eyes. I thought for a moment he might take an instrument from his satchel, but he did not. He just looked, and then he returned to his chair and picked up his tea again. And the other 2 candidates had not noticed because they were discussing a conclave redistricting proposal that neither of them would remember in a week, I noticed. I did not understand what it meant, not yet. The resonance gallery is the oldest part of the fortress. The walls are fitted with pale mineral-bearing stone, quarried from the deep veins beneath the Verath Range, the same deposits Kale Wren had spent 9 years mapping, though I did not make that connection until later. The stones are smooth, translucent at the edges, threaded with fine crystalline structures. that the founders believed carried harmonic resonance. In the old records, the ones I had read as a child, curled up in the East Wing reading alcove while storms rattled the windows, the stones are described as singing when the house's bloodline was in alignment. A true match would make them hum. A false one would leave them silent. They had been silent for decades. I was not sure they still worked. I had swept them that morning and felt nothing under my hands but cold mineral and old dust. My sister entered the gallery at the appointed hour. She wore her formal house robe, deep gray, unembroidered, the Sothkind sigil stitched small at the collar in thread, so old it had faded to near invisibility. Her hair was pulled back in a single braid, black and heavy against the pale lavender of her skin, and her eyes, the bright emerald green that is the Sothkind marker, the one physical trait the censure could not strip, were steady and unreadable. She looked the way she always looks when the conclave is in the room. Composed, precise, armored in stillness. I know the cost of that armor because I have watched her put it on every morning for 26 years. The slow straightening of her spine, the measured exhale, the eyes going flat and formal. It is the posture of a woman who learned at 15 that showing anything would be used against her. I wanted to tell her that she did not have to do this, that the resonance provision was a relic buried in a censure document that the conclave's own legal division had probably forgotten until someone pulled it out during a review cycle and realized it was still enforceable. That standing in a room while 3 strangers decided whether she was worth the political cost of lifting a punishment she had never earned was not justice, it was theater, and the conclave had cast her in the lead without asking whether she wanted the part. But I did not say any of that, because she already knew it, and because saying it would not change anything, and because my sister has never once in 26 years made a decision based on what she wanted. She has made decisions based on what the fortress needed, and what the remaining staff needed, and what the house's diminished standing required, and she has done it without complaint, without self-pity, and without anyone in the conclave noticing or caring. She took her position at the front of the gallery. I stood at her left, 1 step behind, as protocol required. The Sothkind welcomes the conclave's candidates to the resonance trial, I said, reading from my script. Each candidate will address the occupant of the Kian seat in turn. The resonance stones will respond or remain silent. The rite requires no other action. Soroth Vel Iman went first. He stood, straightened his robes, and delivered a 7-minute address that I suspect he had drafted with the help of a diplomatic speechwriter. It was polished. It was formal. It referenced the historical significance of the Soth-Kayan censure, the conclave's commitment to procedural fairness, and his own qualifications as a cultural liaison with experience in inter-house mediation. He addressed my sister as the Soth-Kayan 14 times. I counted because I had nothing else to do, and because each time the title landed without her name attached to it, I felt a small, familiar compression in my chest that I have never been able to name. He never once looked at her eyes. He looked at a point slightly above her head, the way diplomats are trained to do when addressing a censured party, acknowledging presence without conferring recognition. The stones did nothing. Kalith Orasev went second. Her address was shorter. 4 minutes, military cadence, no wasted words. She spoke about strategic value, the Kayan fortress's position on the Verith Range as a border monitoring asset, and the potential for a match-certified alliance to restore the fortress's operational capacity. She outlined force projection benefits, supply line advantages, the mineral wealth in the range beneath us. She addressed my sister as the occupant of the Kayan seat and the designate. She looked at Valara's collar, at the faded sigil, assessing it the way she had assessed the fortress walls. A thing to be evaluated, a variable in a strategic equation. She did not mention my sister's qualifications, her 26 years of governance, her 9 petitions, or the fact that she had held this fortress together with 9 people while the conclave debated whether she deserved a hearing. The stones did nothing. Kael Ren stood up. He left his satchel under his chair. He did not have a prepared address. I could see that immediately. His hands were at his sides, not clasped behind his back in the diplomatic posture, not folded at his waist in the military one. They were just there. He took 2 steps forward, not to the speaking mark on the floor where the other 2 had stood, but slightly to the left of it, slightly closer to my sister, as if he had misjudged the distance, or had not been paying attention to where the mark was. He looked at her, not above her head, not at her collar, at her, and then he said her name, Valara. He said it quietly, not formally, not with the weighted precision of a diplomat deploying a calculated gesture. He said it the way you say the name of a person you have read about and thought about and understood to be a real person with a real name that mattered, and who you are now standing in front of for the first time. He said it like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, like he could not understand why anyone would call her anything else. The gallery went silent. Sorath Veliman's composure cracked for half a second. His eyes widened, his mouth opened, and I saw the diplomatic calculation run across his face in real time. The struck name, the protocol breach, the paperwork. Kalith Oransev did not move, but her hand went to the edge of her armor plate, the way a soldier's hand goes to a weapon when something unexpected happens. My sister's face did not change. Not immediately. She was too practiced for that, too conditioned by 30 years of holding still while people talked past her. But her eyes, those green eyes, the ones the censure could not take, shifted. They locked onto his, and I saw something move behind them that I had not seen in years. Recognition. Not of his face, not of his file, not of his bureaucratic compatibility marker. Recognition of what he had just done. He had said her name. The stones answered. It started low, so low I thought at first it was the wind outside, pushing through the cracks in the eastern parapet the way it always did in late morning. But the wind does not hum in harmony. The wind does not resonate. This did. The pale mineral in the gallery walls began to vibrate at a frequency I could feel in my sternum before I could hear it with my ears. The crystalline threads in the stone caught the thin mountain light and held it, and for a moment the gallery looked the way the old records described it. Alive, the walls humming, the light threading through mineral that had been sleeping for longer than I had been breathing. Sorath Veliman took a step back. Kalith Oransev's hand tightened on her armor plate. Neither of them had made the stones do anything. Kael Ren did not step back. He stood where he was, his hands still at his sides, his eyes still on my sister, and I realized that he was not surprised, not stunned, not awed, not calculating. He looked like a man who had spent 9 years mapping the mineral deposits in the mountains beneath this fortress, who understood what the stones were made of and what they were supposed to do, and who had come here knowing that the only thing they needed was someone to speak the name they had been waiting to hear. He had not come here as filler. He had come here because he had read the old records, the same ones I had read as a child, the ones that described the resonance and the name and what the founders had built this fortress to hold, and he had understood them, not as folklore, not as a political provision, as a fact about what the stones were and what they required. My sister looked at him for a long time. The stones hummed. The gallery was silent, except for that low, steady vibration and the wind outside and the sound of my own breathing, which I was trying very hard to keep even. Then she spoke. "You read the archive," she said. It was not a question. "The geological survey maps reference the resonance veins," Cale said. His voice was unhurried, careful, the voice of a man accustomed to reporting findings accurately. "The mineral composition is in the public record. The harmonic properties are not. Those are in the House archive, which the conclave declassified as part of the censure because they did not think any of it mattered. I read it on a field terminal 3 years ago, during a storm delay at the Southern Relay Station." He paused. "It mentioned your name 17 times. It described the resonance right as a recognition of the person, not the title. The stones do not respond to the Soth Can. They respond to Velara." "My struck name," she said. "Your name," he said. "The founders did not build this fortress around a title. They built it around a person." Sorath Velleman cleared his throat. "The protocol does not. The protocol struck her name," Cale said, still looking at my sister. "The stones did not." The hum was spreading. I could feel it in the gallery floor now, a vibration running through the old foundation stone and up through the soles of my shoes. The walls were bright with threaded light. I realized with a clarity that felt almost physical that the fortress had been waiting for this, not for a candidate, not for a political resolution, not for a bureaucratic provision to be fulfilled. It had been waiting for someone to walk into this room and do the one thing that 30 years of diplomats and auditors and relief coordinators never done. Say her name like she was a person. I do not know how long the silence lasted after that. It felt like a long time. The stones continued to hum, not louder, not building to a crescendo, just steady, a low, even tone that filled the gallery, the way warmth fills a room when a fire catches. The crystalline threads in the walls pulsed with thin light, and the mountain air coming through the open terrace doors carried the sound out across the courtyard, across the parapet, across the Verith Range, where it probably dissipated into the wind and the altitude and the empty sky. But inside the gallery it held. Kalith Oransev removed her hand from her armor plate. She looked at the walls, then at my sister, then at Cale, and I watched her tactical mind work through the situation and arrive at the same conclusion I had. This was not a breach of protocol. This was the protocol, the real one. The one the conclave had declassified because they thought it was folklore, because they did not believe that a name spoken in a stone room could carry weight, because they had never bothered to come up here and sweep the gallery floor and listen. Sorath Velleman was already composing his report. I could see it in his face, the diplomatic machinery engaging, the phrases forming, anomalous resonance event, unanticipated candidate response, recommend, further review. He would file it with the Cultural Liaison Office, and it would enter the same queue as my sister's 9 petitions, and it would sit there. But the stones were humming, and my sister was looking at a human surveyor with weathered elbows and a broken jaw, and her eyes were bright, and her hands, which had been behind her back in the formal posture since she entered the gallery, came forward and rested at her sides, open, the way a person's hands rest when they stop holding themselves in place. "You came 600 kilometers, she said. "I mapped most of them already," he said. "The last 90 were new." She almost smiled. "Not quite. 30 years of practiced composure does not break in a single morning, but the architecture of it was there, the corners of her mouth, the shift in her eyes, the way her shoulders dropped a fraction of a centimeter, releasing tension she had been carrying so long it had become structural. I looked at him. I looked at her. I looked at the gallery, at the humming stones, at the two conclave candidates standing in a room that had just told them, in the oldest language the fortress knew, that they were not the ones it had been waiting for. And I said it. I did not plan it. I did not draft it or rehearse it the way I had rehearsed the reception script. It came out of me the way the hum had come out of the stones, not because I decided to speak, but because the silence had gone on long enough and someone in this fortress needed to say what was true. "That is the one," I said. My voice was steady. I was surprised by that. I had expected it to shake. I am not the composed one. I am not the one who holds still. I am the one who sweeps floors and writes scripts and keeps the east wing from flooding. But my voice was steady, and the gallery heard it, and the stones held their hum, and my sister looked at me with those green eyes, and I saw in them something I had not seen since I was 4 years old, and she was 11, and the conclave had not yet taken her name. She looked relieved, not joyful, not triumphant, not vindicated, relieved. The way a person looks when they have been holding something heavy for a very long time and someone finally says, "I see that. You can set it down." Cale Wren did not move. He did not reach for her, did not bow, did not make a speech. He stood in the gallery with his hands at his sides and the stones humming in the walls around him, and he waited. He was good at waiting. 9 years of field surveys in the Vareth Range had taught him that the patience to stand in one place and let the data come to you, to let the mountain show you what it was made of, instead of telling it what you expected to find. My sister took one step forward, not toward him, exactly. Toward the center of the gallery, where the resonance was strongest, where the crystalline threads in the floor met the crystalline threads in the walls, and the whole room held a single sustained note that I could feel in my teeth and my wrists and the bottoms of my feet. "Marit," she said, and I realized it was the first time she had used my name in days. "Please note in the household record that the resonance right has returned a response. Candidate 3. The stones have answered." "I will," I said. "And note," she said, and her voice was even, and her eyes were bright, and her hands were open at her sides, "that the response was given to the name, not the title." Soreth Veliman opened his mouth to object. I saw the diplomatic phrasing forming on his lips, the careful with respect to the censure provision, but Calith Oronsev put a hand on his arm. She shook her head once, a small, precise motion. The military strategist had assessed the situation. The fortress had spoken. There was nothing left to calculate. I watched Soreth's mouth close. I watched the diplomatic machinery behind his eyes recalibrate, shifting from objection to damaged, control to something that might, eventually, become acceptance. He was not a cruel man, I believe that. He was a product of a system that had spent 30 years calling a woman by her title because the paperwork required it, and he had never once stopped to wonder what it cost her. He had not been taught to wonder. The conclave does not train its diplomats in that particular skill. Calith, though, Calith understood. I could see it in her face. Not warmth, exactly. Recognition. The strategist had identified the strongest position in the room, and it was not hers, and she had the professional clarity to acknowledge that without resentment. She gave my sister a short nod. Not a bow, not deference, just one officer recognizing another, and stepped back. I wrote it down. I had a small tablet tucked into my sleeve, the household record, the only administrative tool I had left, the one I used for supply orders and maintenance logs, and the quarterly reports that no one at the conclave ever read. I opened it to a new entry, and I wrote, "Resonance right conducted. Candidates Veliman and Oran Sev. No response. Candidate Wren. full harmonic resonance upon spoken address using the given name Velara. Stones active, duration ongoing, witnessed by Marit Soth Khan, household advisor. I paused, then I added one more line. The fortress remembers. It was not part of the protocol. It was not a phrase from the old records, or a line from the censure provision, or anything I had rehearsed. But it was true. The fortress remembered. The stones remembered, and now, after 30 years, someone else did too. Cale looked at the walls one more time. Then back at my sister. His expression had not changed. The same quiet attention, the same steady composure, but there was something in the set of his jaw, in the way his weight had shifted forward, onto the balls of his feet. That told me he understood the size of what had just happened, and was choosing not to perform it. He was not going to kneel. He was not going to make declarations. He had said her name. The stones had answered. That was enough. My sister and Cale Wren stood in the gallery, with the mountain light threading through the walls and the hum filling the room like breath filling. Lungs, and neither of them spoke, and neither of them moved, and it was the most alive I had seen the Kayan fortress since before the censure, since before the name was struck, since before the last custodial aide left, and the prayer flags blew off the parapet, and the population dropped to 9. Outside, the wind pushed across the Verith range the way it always did, carrying thin air and loose gravel, and the sound of the stones through the courtyard and out across the mountains. Eventually, someone at the conclave would hear about this, and there would be hearings and filings and a queue that might finally move. But that was later. That was bureaucracy. That was paperwork. What I saw in that gallery was simpler than any of it. A man had walked 600 kilometers. He had read the old records. He had learned a name that the conclave struck and the stones kept. And he had said it aloud, in a room built to listen, to a woman who had not heard it from a stranger in 30 years. He said it like it mattered, because it did. The name was not ceremonial. It was not a political instrument or a diplomatic courtesy or a line in a protocol manual. It was a woman's name, given to her before she was old enough to carry its weight, taken from her before she was old enough to fight for it, and held its stone, held in old records, held in a fortress that the conclave had tried to empty and could not quite manage because 9 people and 1 sister had refused to leave. The stones agreed. I stood at my sister's left, 1 step behind as protocol required, but I was smiling. I could not help it. The gallery was humming, and the light was moving in the walls, and the wind was carrying the sound out across a range of mountains that a quiet human surveyor had spent 9 years learning the shape of, and my sister's name, her real name, the one the conclave struck and the stones kept, was in the air again, Velara. It sounded like the fortress waking up.